Ladies and gentlemen, I've got the easiest job of anybody in this room. Even tonight, I have the easiest job of anybody in this room. And this evening, that is to do two things. One is to say welcome, and the other is to tell you about the drinks afterwards. The drinks afterwards are upstairs on the 12th floor. We encourage you all to come and to enjoy continuing what will no doubt have been already by then a very interesting debate. In terms of welcome, I will say only this. We Hogan Lovells are delighted to see so many old friends in the room, so many friendly organisations in one room at a time, which must be something of a record for them. It is sometimes easy to think that the rule of law is something that we in the Western world have, and that we proudly export it to the rest of the world. And then sometimes there are events that make you think that maybe our grip on it is not as firm as we imagined. Some people would say that on both sides of the Atlantic in the last couple of years, such events have happened, and it is as important as ever that in the UK, in the US and elsewhere, we stand up for liberty and the rule of law. And that is what we're going to hear about this evening. I'm delighted that you'll be here to hear it, and I hope you have a fascinating time. Thank you all very much for coming.
Yes, thank you. Can I, on behalf of Alba, thank Hogan Lovells and the HRLA for coming together to co-host this event. Before I introduce our speakers, I should continue on, I'm afraid, a very sad note, which is that, as you will have heard, Sir Henry Brooke very sadly passed away last week, and he was a true friend of liberty and a man of huge intellect, which was matched by his great generosity of spirit. He was a restless blogger and always ready to give his time to speak when asked. And this is something that he said in the aftermath of the Grenfell tragedy, which perhaps resonates with what we're saying, or what the topic of this evening. And what he wrote was, we've all got to be a bit humbler about the scale of our ignorance and about the need for greater empathy with those who struggle against the odds in a world all too fond, in the interest of saving money, of diminishing the privileges and protections they used to enjoy. Can I move on now to introduce our speakers for this evening? First of all, David Cole, who is currently legal director of the American Civil Liberties Union. It's completely inadequate to say that he's got a distinguished record of promoting and litigating civil liberties. After a period at the Centre for Constitutional Rights, he joined Georgetown University Law Centre, where he remained until 2016, fighting and litigating civil liberties cases at the highest level. And his successes have included pivotal free expression challenges, such as Texas and Johnson, the flag-burning case. His anticipated, or at least hoped-for, successes include Masterpiece Cake Shop, which is a case currently where judgments are waited before the Supreme Court on the question whether freedom of speech or religious freedom on the part of a baker justifies their right not to sell a wedding cake to a same-sex couple. And judgment in that case is awaited. Those or similar achievements have caused him to be described as one of the nation's most accomplished advocates for freedom of expression. He joined the ACLU in July 2016, no doubt thinking he had a quieter life there. But that very month, Donald Trump received the Republican nomination. And the day after his election, the ACLU wrote an open letter outlining some of the more eye-catching election pledges and promising that if he tried to implement them, he would face the full firepower of the ACLU at your every step. In the year since the President took office, the ACLU's kept its word, and there's something in excess of 100 actions have been brought by the ACLU challenging one aspect or another of the administration's policies. Perhaps best known is the action against the Muslim travel ban, where there are several actions being brought. This was the action where one of the earlier proceedings was described as being taken by a so-called judge. And the litigation continues. There's a case which is going to be heard by the Supreme Court in April, where in fact Home and Lovells are acting and the ACLU are acting in a companion case to that. Our second speaker, who's going to be responding to David, is Martha Spurrier. She's been Director of Liberty since 2016, May 2016, and she fully deserves her inclusion in the 2017 Hot 100 list as daring, innovative and creative. Before joining Liberty, she'd been involved in an impressive number of cases, up to the Supreme Court and the ECHR, and she's forbidden me to give details because there's too many of them, and she's a determined advocate for human rights. She was responsible for the Act campaign that you may have seen, where posters about arguing for the retention of the HRA, and that, of course, is an issue that's more pressing than ever. So before I pass on to David Cole, those of you who want to Twitter, you can get onto the Hogan Lovells website. You don't need a password, and there's the hashtag #FrontlineLiberty, which I'm told is going to be useful so that it can be storified. I'm told. But, if I can pass on now to David Cole.
Thank you. Thank you to Alba and the Human Rights Lawyers Association and Liberty and Hogan Lovells for sponsoring this talk. Thank you for coming. I want to talk tonight about the state of liberty in the United States in the age of Trump, and I want to suggest that while Trump poses a unique threat to civil liberties and has posed a unique threat to civil liberties, he also, I think, poses a unique opportunity for civil liberties over the long term. And it's really that opportunity that I want to focus on and try to convince you of, because I'm sure you don't need a lot of convincing that he poses a threat to civil liberties, but the opportunity may be less clear. These are very different times from the times when I agreed to take the job at the ACLU. It was the summer before the election. I was recruited to the job by the executive director, who said to me, he said, "David, you know, you've been practicing constitutional law and writing and teaching about constitutional law for 30-some years under a conservative majority Supreme Court. Just think what it would be like to lead the ACLU under a liberal majority Supreme Court." Because at that time, of course, we all knew Hillary Clinton was going to win the election. She was going to get to name the successor seat for Justice Scalia, and that would shift the political valence on the court from conservative liberal, which it had been for the last 4 decades, my entire legal career, to a liberal majority. And I went to law school in the 1980s, and I was taught by professors who had come up themselves under the Warren Court era. That was the one era in American history where the Supreme Court was a real force for social justice under the Warren Court. And so they taught me about the possibility of the Supreme Court being a real positive force for social justice, and then they threw me out into the world to practice under a conservative majority Supreme Court for 30-some years. So it seemed like a great opportunity. I signed on the bottom line. I didn't put in a what if condition, because there was no what if. Everybody knew what was going to happen. Hillary Clinton would win, and we would be off to the races. And in fact, before I started, I had the lawyers at the ACLU work up memos on areas of constitutional doctrine that under a liberal Supreme Court we might be able to push in a more progressive direction. Those memos are now in the file, and so the job changed on November 8th in really surprising ways. But of course, in many respects, it is a more important, it's certainly more challenging, but more important job in the current environment than in the alternative universe that that I wish I was living in. And I think there have been many signs that the American people understand the nature of the threat and also understand the importance of responding to the threat. So, first a word about the threat, and then a word about the response. The threat, I think, is best captured by reflecting on how many of the attributes of President Trump's behavior are typical of the attributes of autocrats in other countries. So he appeals to emotion rather than reason. He is derisive and dismissive of what the facts are, and openly willing to lie, and to lie in ways that are obviously false. The Washington Post has a fact checker who has been doing a running tally of false, demonstrably false statements, not statements about which you disagree and so you call them false, but demonstrably false factual statements by the president in his first year in office, and the tally is now over 2,000 false statements. He demonizes the enemy, crooked Hillary. He encouraged his crowds at his campaign stops to chant "Lock her up." He threatened that he would indeed seek to lock her up if he were elected. He has attacked central constitutional constraints in our democracy. The press he calls the enemy of the people, and he repeatedly derides them as engaging in what he calls fake news whenever they report on the truth that he doesn't like. And he's attacked the courts, as was indicated earlier, referring to the first judge who issued a nationwide injunction against the Muslim ban as a so-called judge, and pardoning. The only pardon he has issued thus far, although he's apparently considering pardoning himself, but the only pardon that he's issued thus far is a pardon of a man named Joe Arpaio, who was a sheriff in Arizona, who was convicted for criminally violating a court order that prohibited him from engaging in racial profiling, and Donald Trump issued a pardon to that man who was found guilty of violating a court order. A basic lack of respect for the rule of law. He has sought repeatedly to interfere in an ongoing criminal investigation, that is, of his own alleged or possible collusion with the Russians in stealing the election. He fired the head of the FBI when the head of the FBI, James Comey, would not dismiss an investigation and prosecution of one of his top aides. And he has threatened to fire Robert Mueller, who is the special prosecutor who was appointed in the wake of James Comey's firing. And he is engaged in the very kind of xenophobic scapegoating that you see in so many other countries these days, here included. So it's not just that he advances views that are a threat to basic constitutional freedoms, but that in whole he's acting like an autocrat, not like a leader of a constitutional democracy. So that is a threat, but it is also an opportunity, and it is an opportunity that I think we can build on if, in fact, the American people respond by recognizing the threat and recognizing that there are institutions and important opportunities to fight back against that threat. And I think thus far we've seen a great deal of evidence that, in fact, the American people have responded in that way. So you see that in many, there are many pieces of evidence to support that. One is the Women's March. The first is the Women's March, which was the day after the inauguration, and made the crowds at the inauguration seem very small in comparison, much to President Trump's continuing dismay. You see it in the airport demonstrations that occurred in the immediate wake of the first Muslim ban, which I'll talk about in a moment. You see it in town halls that responded to his repeated efforts to overturn our Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, which provides some measure of health insurance to most Americans. You see it in countless demonstrations on behalf of the Dreamers, who are the children, undocumented children who were brought here by their parents and who were given a kind of protection from deportation by President Obama, and now may lose it under President Trump. And we see it at the ACLU. So I often, tell people ask me, well, how are you doing? I said, well, I started in January of last year, and before I started at the ACLU, we had 400,000 members. It's a pretty large organization, 400,000 members. Today we have 1.75 million members. Now that's the difference between correlation and causation. It has, I can take credit for one of those new members. My dad joined, but I think Donald Trump can take credit for all the rest. But that's a remarkable turn of events, and it's not just the ACLU, Planned Parenthood, the Center for Constitutional Rights, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, Common Cause, a whole host of civil society organizations that stand for the very principles and values that Trump threatens, have seen a tremendous upsurge in support from the citizenry. And this has led to growing membership lists, but it also has led to growing activism. So we have launched something called People Power, the first for our organization. The ACLU has been around for almost 100 years, which in the United States is a long time. I know that's not a long time here, but we were founded in 1920. But we have generally been an organization that focuses on the courts with lawyers. We have 300 lawyers, and we file a lot of cases. We also have lobbyists who are also generally lawyers who engage with the state houses in the states and with Congress. We have a communications team and the like. But what we have launched now is a grassroots mobilization tool. It's called People Power. It encourages people around the country to come together in their communities and to engage in advocacy for civil liberties ends in their communities. not as ACLU people, as citizens of the United States. And we give them guidance. We have we've run 2 campaigns thus far. The first was a sanctuary campaign, which was to encourage citizens to go to their local towns and cities, governments, and ask them to adopt pro-immigrant policies. States and localities have a choice as to whether they enforce anti-immigrant measures put in place by the federal government. The federal government can enforce those policies, but it can't require states and localities to enforce them under our Constitution because we have federalist protection of the local governments. And so it's up to the local governments. And so we sent people out to encourage cities and towns to adopt sanctuary pro-immigrant policies. Many did. We've now launched a 50-state campaign with specific agendas for each state to open up the vote, to fight against voter suppression, and make it easier for people to register and vote across the country. And hundreds of thousands of people have signed up to engage in these sorts of actions. Millions of people have come together in homes and watched the events we hold to launch these campaigns, to sort of give them direction as to how to go forth. And we're not the only ones who are doing this. Out of the Women's March grew something called Huddles, which was a very similar citizen-based initiative of people who went to the Women's March were just inspired to be surrounded by so many people who care so much about the values that were under attack. And they came together, again, in homes and chose various political actions to take to advance and defend liberty. The same thing happened with respect to a pamphlet that was put out in the immediate aftermath of Trump's election by a group of former staffers of Congress. It's called Indivisible, and it basically is just a kind of how-to on how to be effective in lobbying your state legislature or your federal representative. And they published it online, put it up online. Millions of copies were downloaded, and indivisible groups began sprouting up spontaneously around the country to put in action the methods that were put into this pamphlet. So much that Indivisible is now an organization that works to facilitate this newfound energy. So there's just tremendous energy on the part. I have never, in my lifetime as a sentient being on this earth, I have not seen this kind of civic engagement ever before. I think the last time in the United States you had something like this level of civic engagement, it was around the Vietnam War. And of course, the Vietnam War had associated with it a draft, which meant that every young man was potentially subject to being drafted and sent to Vietnam. And so every young man and every family of every young man had a personal self-interest in and engaged they did. But we're seeing that level of engagement now around civil liberties and civil rights. And that, I think, is that's the silver lining. That if we can focus that and direct it and organize it, I think in the long term this could be. We could look back on this period as a period of time in which we went through some dark times, and some people were some very bad policies were adopted, and many people were hurt. But the American people responded in such a way that we learned from this period the importance of defending and standing up for liberty, and in the long term, that could well be, that is, I think, where our salvation will lie if we are saved. So many people say, well, that's all well and good, but how are you going to push back? I mean, as a practical matter, how are you going to push back against this president? He's got a Republican House. He's got a Republican Senate. He has a majority of Republican-appointed justices on the Supreme Court. 2/3 of the state legislatures are Republican. Where's the opposition going to come from? Where's the resistance going to come from? And that's a good question. That's a good question. In a one party, in a sort of essentially a single party control of the levers of power, separation of powers and federalism, which is generally where we look for constitutional constraint, is challenged. But I think, and I think in ordinary times, ordinarily we do have divided government, and separation of powers actually works quite well at checking abuses by one branch or another. In this period, we don't have that opportunity, and so I think in times like this, what you need to look to are other forums for checks and balances, and many of them less formal. So one is formal, and that is the courts. So even though the Supreme Court has a majority of Republican appointees, and even though President Trump is continuing to appoint many judges who are very, very conservative and more likely to align with him, it still is the case that the judiciary in the United States, even though it is appointed in a political way, much more political way than here, its self-identity is to be independent, and its institutional structure is to be independent, life tenure, and its legitimacy turns on its independence, and as a result, the courts can be, in these times, an important focus for checking the administration. And indeed they have been. Thus far, just to name a few of the instances in which courts have ruled against the Trump administration, the Muslim ban, which has been struck down repeatedly by a whole number of courts across the country. It is now going to the Supreme Court. President Trump's ban on transgender people serving in the military has been enjoined by two federal courts, and two federal courts of appeals have rejected the administration's requests for stays pending appeal of those injunctions. The President Trump's revocation of the protection for the Dreamers has been enjoined by a federal court. President Trump's order allowing employers to refuse to cover contraception for their employers under their insurance plans has been enjoined by the courts. President Trump's threat to deny federal funding to cities and towns that adopted those pro-immigrant sanctuary policies that we were seeking has been enjoined by the courts. President Trump's the Trump administration's efforts to deny undocumented teenagers access to abortion in the United States has been enjoined by the courts. And just a word about this: when an undocumented minor gets captured in the United States, they are held by a federal agency called the Office of Refugee Resettlement. And the head of the Office of Refugee Resettlement under President Trump has no experience with refugees or resettlement or immigration but he's an avid anti-abortion advocate. And he has decided that he will use the fact that these young women are in federal custody to deny them release to clinics to obtain abortions to which they are constitutionally and legally entitled. And we have thus far filed 4 actions on behalf of 4 different undocumented teenagers who learned that they were pregnant, sought an abortion, were authorized to get an abortion under the relevant state law, and then were barred from getting that abortion because essentially the jailer wouldn't open the door to let them get out to a clinic to get the treatment to which they are entitled. And in every case, again, the courts have enjoined the president's actions. These courts include judges who've been appointed by Democratic presidents, judges who've appointed by Republican presidents. The courts have been, thus far in any event, have stood fast against the president's actions. None of these cases have yet gotten up to the Supreme Court, so we will see what happens when they actually get to the Supreme Court. But at the lower court level, in any event, the courts have been an important source of a check in this time. But of course, the courts are not the only check, and I don't even think they're the most significant check. I think in times like this, you also need to rely on the more informal checks and balances, which are protected by liberty. They're protected in our Constitution by the First Amendment in particular. So what does the First Amendment protect? It protects the rights of speech, of press, of religion, and the like. And oftentimes we think of those rights as individual rights, as they're protected because as part of being a human being is having the freedom to say what you want, to think what you want, to associate with whom you want, to worship who you want, to write about what you want, and the like. And that is a core purpose of the First Amendment. But what I think you see in times like this is that a second purpose, and an equally core purpose, maybe even a more core purpose of the First Amendment, of this liberty, these liberties, is as a check on abuse, a structural check on governmental abuse of power. The press, by reporting on it. Religious institutions, by having an independent basis for normative judgment and critique. Universities, which are protected by the First Amendment. Having a basis for independent critique. Civil society, groups like Liberty, Alba, the Human Rights Lawyers Association, the ACLU. Civil society organizations are just citizens coming together in association to defend principles and values that they believe in. And all of this is the exercise of liberty, but it serves a structural role in checking the administration. And that's why I think you see autocratic leaders single out the press, universities, religions, and civil society for repression and suppression when they have the opportunity to do so. Precisely because they understand that these are checks on their potential checks on their authority. These are sites of resistance. And I think what you see in the era following Trump's election is that each of these potential sites of resistance has come forward, has responded, and has achieved significant support from the American public as a result, and I think has functioned to ensure that while Trump poses these threats and while he engages in conduct that's not that different from Orban, not that different from Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, he has not been able to put in place the kind of autocratic regime that he might like to put in place because there is a robust and resilient civil society, which we sometimes call resistance. So let me talk about the Muslim ban case, just as an example of how I think this comes together. That is the engagement of the citizenry, the organized activity of civil society, and courts playing the role that they are designed to play in a constitutional democracy. So the Muslim ban was issued 6 days after the president took the oath of office. It's not a mistake. It's not. He picked the Muslim ban as his first major initiative for good reason. He knew, and his advisors knew, that historically speaking, when the government goes after foreigners and does it in the name of national security, the citizenry is not likely to object. That was certainly the lesson of the Palmer raids in 1919 and 1920, when a series of terrorist bombings led to the roundup of thousands and deportation of thousands of immigrants in the United States. That was certainly the lesson of George Bush in the War on Terror, in which he too rounded up thousands of immigrants in the wake of 9/11, none of whom had anything to do with 9/11. And put in place a whole series of policies, including torture, that were targeted specifically and only at foreign nationals. So Trump took a sort of tried and true path. But what was remarkable about it is that the response of the American people was not to say, well, somebody else's rights that are at issue, and so I'm not going to worry about it. He issued the ban on a Friday. That night, we filed the first case challenging the ban on behalf of two men who were held at JFK Airport. The next day, tens of thousands of Americans went out to airports around the country, even airports that had no international travel whatsoever, to protest this action. And there's two things that are remarkable about that. One is they are protesting not for their own rights, but for the rights of foreigners, of Muslim foreigners. Second thing that's remarkable about that is that it was at an airport. I don't know about you, but the last place I want to be, unless I have to travel somewhere, is an airport. It's a soul-killing atmosphere, right? But people got off of their couches, went out in droves to airports across the country to condemn what the president was doing and to stand in solidarity with the people who were being held. Lawyers went out and volunteered their time. And cases were filed across the country on behalf of people who were detained at the airports under the ban. We got the first injunction against that ban that Saturday night. So we filed. It was put in place on Friday. Friday night, we filed a habeas corpus action on behalf of two men who were detained. Saturday night, the court held an emergency hearing in the case in a federal courthouse in Brooklyn. That courthouse was surrounded by several thousand people that night because they knew the hearing was going on because of Twitter, chanting, ACLU, ACLU, we stand with you. I can guarantee you that has never happened before in the history of the ACLU. And yet, there they were. And sure enough, the court issued an injunction, the first injunction against the ban, and then a series of courts thereafter, in cases that we filed, in cases that others filed, have done the same thing. But it wasn't just people in the streets. It was also the elite. It was the academy. The leaders of all the major universities signed a petition condemning the action. The leaders of all the major science organizations signed a petition condemning the action. The leaders of Silicon Valley's largest businesses signed an amicus brief arguing against the Muslim ban. The national security establishment came out against. They've rarely come out against the executive branch. That weekend, Michael Hayden, I don't know if anyone here has heard of Michael Hayden. Michael Hayden is a general. He came to fame in the United States because under President George W. Bush, he headed up the CIA and the NSA, the National Security Agency, the one that does all the spying. He's a devout defender of the CIA's interrogation program, otherwise known as the torture program. I have debated him on numerous occasions about that very program. That weekend, he tweeted, first of all, what's a former head of the CIA tweeting? Well, that just shows you where we've come with respect to Twitter. He tweeted, how about that, ACLU and I in the same corner? And he signed a brief condemning the Muslim ban. Dick Cheney, you've heard of Dick Cheney? He said, this is not who we are as Americans. And John Yoo, who was a once obscure lawyer who came to prominence because he, as a Justice Department lawyer, wrote the memo authorizing President Bush to put in place the CIA torture program, notwithstanding bans on torture. He said that he had finally found an executive action that went beyond the pale. And so in some sense, the nation responded. The nation responded, and indeed, the courts then struck down the ban time and time again. I thought the moment, from the ACLU standpoint, I told you we went from 400,000 members to 1.75 million members. We got the weekend of the first Muslim ban case and the first injunction against the Muslim ban, we got 330,000 new members in one weekend. We had 400,000 members. We almost doubled our size in a single weekend. People were so concerned and energized by what they saw. And our mantra, really since President Trump came to power, was, we'll see you in court. You go on our website, it says, we'll see you in court. And it was basically, if you do the things that you said you were going to do, like ban Muslims, we'll see you in court. I think the moment that the ACLU really arrived was the week after the first decision in the Muslim ban case. The New York Times, which has a crossword puzzle, that crossword puzzle enthusiasts, they can't, my wife's a crossword puzzle enthusiast. She, as soon as it comes out, the night before the daily paper on her phone, she's doing it, and people across the country do the New York Times crossword puzzle. The week after the Muslim ban, there was a clue in the crossword puzzle, group that told President Trump, we'll see you in court. And the answer was the ACLU. That's when you know you've arrived, when you're the answer to a clue in the New York Times crossword puzzle. But that response, I think, is part of why you have seen courts in a case that involves immigrants' rights, not usually an area where the courts go out of their way, a case that involves national security claims, not usually an area where the courts go out of their way, and a case in which the president is invoking his power pursuant to statute to act in response to national security, not usually an area where the courts respond. The courts have uniformly ruled against the president's actions. So, and I think that's just an illustration, but that's to me, that is how liberty is protected. It is protected when courts do their job, but also when the citizenry does its job. And the citizenry does its job by exercising civil liberties in defense of those very civil liberties. And they do it through the kinds of organizations that sponsored this evening's event. So let me. I want to have time for questions. So let me close with two quotes. One is from a federal judge by the name of Learned Hand. Some say he's the greatest federal judge never to be named to the Supreme Court. Now that my wife is a federal judge, I no longer agree with that, but many people agree with that. In 1944, he made a speech in Central Park to 150,000 newly naturalized U.S. citizens. These are foreign nationals who came to the United States, took the test, became citizens, and they have these naturalization ceremonies where everyone takes the oath and becomes an American. And he was asked to give the speech to this massive naturalization ceremony in Central Park in 1944. And in that speech, which he called the Spirit of Liberty, he said, "Liberty lies in the hearts of men and women. When it dies there, no constitution, no law, no court can save it. While it lies there, it needs no constitution, no law, no court to save it." Now, like many great quotes, this is an overstatement. We do need the Constitution, we do need law, and we do need courts. And in this room, I'll say we need lawyers. But I think it has a critically important insight. And that is that the ultimate defense of liberty is in the hearts of the citizens. And that, too, is why this is a moment of opportunity, because people have seen the threat, people have responded to the threat, and if we can deploy that response in a thoughtful and positive and affirmative way, we can nurture the liberty that lies in people's hearts, and that, at the end of the day, is our salvation. Now, some people say, well, yeah, but. You're looking at it through the glass half full, but in fact, it's a much more challenging situation, and we could have somebody else get up and make a very pessimistic speech. And to that, I'd say that's true. That's true. But I'll close with this quote. It's a quote from a couple of Harvard professors in a book called The Future of American Progressivism. It's a disturbingly thin book, but it has this insight. And they say hope is more the consequence of action than its cause. Just as this gaze of the spectator favors fatalism, so the action of the agent produces hope. And what they mean by that, I think, is it's not that you're either born hopeful or you're born a skeptic. It's not that you have like a DNA, an element in your DNA that makes you hopeful. Hope doesn't precede action. Hope is produced by action. And skepticism is produced by sitting back and spectating. And so we have two choices. We can spectate and be skeptical, or we can act and produce hope. And to me, that means we have one choice. Thank you.
here before and I almost feel very short. There's a very funny thing that happens to me. It happened to me just then listening to David, and it's happened to me before talking to friends from the ACLU and from other organisations in the States, where you hear about Trump and what he's doing and you hear about the response and you find yourself feeling really envious. And you have to check yourself because, of course, I don't wish upon this country a president like Donald Trump. But I think something that certainly we at Liberty are searching for sometimes is that crystallising moment that does mean that people get off the sofa and go to the airport and protest. And it can't be right that you need things to get that bad before people will become that active. But what do you do when things aren't quite that bad, even though there are some really bad things and some things that people should really care very deeply about? How do you galvanise people in that moment so that you don't even have to get to the point of Donald Trump being your president or your prime minister? And I realise that that's a kind of be careful what you wish for moment, but it really is the sort of emotional response I have to this. And obviously, selfishly, I hear about the hundreds of thousands of members and I do the maths calculation of the funding, and there's a self-interest there. There was a great bit of polling after the referendum, and I don't think that Brexit was our Trump, and I don't actually think that analogy is a very smart one. But it characterised the 48% and how they were feeling after the referendum. And it had a little graphic of a person with their head on their desk, and it just said, devastated pessimists. And I remember thinking, well, they're not going to do very much over the next few years. But I think two things have come out quite clearly, and I think Trump has helped us crystallise these feelings in a way. I had two interesting moments not long after Trump's election and during our own political turbulence of the last 18 months. The first was when I was walking to Downing Street to protest against, you remember when the Muslim ban was announced and Theresa May was going over there to talk with Donald Trump, and he had also refused to outright condemn torture. And people had then turned to Theresa May and looked to her to outright condemn torture and to condemn the Muslim ban. And she had been less than forthcoming about doing that, although eventually she did come around to it. And I was walking down Whitehall to this protest and walking with a couple who I don't know. And they said, we just can't believe that in a civilised nation there are immigrants being detained at airports. And I said, do you know in the UK, every year, 30,000 immigrants are detained on the say-so of the executive just outside airports. They're detained indefinitely in this country. It's been going on for years. And they didn't know. And that was a bit of a radicalising moment, I think, for them. And I've had that conversation a number of times with people here. And the other anecdote that happens again and again is about surveillance. And I think in this country, very often, not that I wish to generalise, but very often there is a sense of if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear. And I think the Snowden revelations here caused some consternation in the States, but also in other European countries, with the lack of outrage from the citizenry about the extent of mass surveillance being used without lawful authority by various different intelligence agencies. But when you say, well, imagine now a situation where it's Donald Trump getting your communications data. It's Donald Trump knowing the websites that you visited and the ins and outs of your Facebook profile. And that includes the protests that you go on and the places that you pray, and it includes the time that you Google an abortion clinic. And again, it's a small rhetorical device that suddenly brings home something to people that hasn't changed. In my view, there's every reason to be sceptical about the executive having that information. But Donald Trump somehow helps to bring that alive for people who otherwise might put themselves in the camp of nothing to hide and nothing to fear. And those are just two examples of things where it's a way in for us to say, well, actually, take that just one step more extreme and see for yourself how frightening it is. Or be a little more vigilant about what is happening a little bit closer to home. Similar conversations, I think, were had around the time of the election when the DUP partnership was entered into. And suddenly people realised that abortion is criminal in Northern Ireland. And again, I was having conversations with people, well-informed, right-thinking people, who had no idea that in the United Kingdom we have a regime which criminalises women that is more extreme than many other countries around the world, that some of those people who I would have conversations with would protest against. Women who had been outside the Polish embassy when Poland was trying to bring into force very strict laws criminalising women seeking abortions. Some of those women did not know that those Polish laws were nothing compared to the life sentence that you can still receive in Northern Ireland if you seek a termination. So I think that perhaps there is some power in the reminder to be vigilant, that there is some power in the reminder that the institutions are powerful, of course, and important, but that they're not everything, that they may not always be these strong and independent bastions of liberal democracy, because, of course, they too are often instruments of power. And so use them when you can, and that's, of course, what activist lawyers do, but also be good at interrogating the times when they will uphold exactly the things that you are trying to dismantle. So what I hope is that, to reframe David's question, that people in the UK will start to understand the nature of the threat, and that by doing that, people in the UK will start to understand the importance of the response. And I think also that goes both ways. I think there are some perhaps more uncomfortable conversations. I think in this room, many of the things that we're talking about, everyone would agree on. And it's often the way when we speak in these kinds of echo chambers, and that, I think, often is a failing of our movement. But one thing that we've seen here in the last few years, and again, there have been echoes of it on the other side of the Atlantic, is a tendency to give up free speech, and a tendency to say that actually people will be no platformed, that there have to be safe spaces, and to take on the idea of censorship as being part of a progressive movement. Now, obviously, that's a dynamic that's as old as time, and you only have to look to, for example, former communist countries and look at their hate crime laws to see that those laws are much more censorious than a UK free speech model would ever allow, let alone a US free speech model, which is even stronger. But I think what we really owe it to ourselves and owe it to our ideals to do is to be vigilant not only in thinking about the times when the things that come very instinctively to us are challenged, but also to stand up often to friends and allies when the things that we think are important are also under threat, but from our own side sometimes. And at Liberty, I think we have very often, without wishing to gloss the nuance of the debate, we have very often watched with some concern as free speech has been something that it has become easy to seek to erode. Because, of course, if you study the history of free speech and the theory behind it, it is in a way the most progressive right of all, because it is the right that says the powerful do not have the right to silence you. And so where would the civil rights movement have been without free speech? And where would feminism be without free speech? And in the moment, if we think that free speech is just a tool of the far right, or just a tool of the powerful, then we risk giving over to the establishment the power to censor, which in the end, because it is the establishment and because it is the powerful, will be used against the people who are already marginalised. When thinking about free speech, I also think sometimes we struggle in this country because we don't have a First Amendment. And we could debate the merits of a written constitution uphill and down dale, but the fact is that I think there are times as a lawyer and as a campaigner where you look around for the things that enshrine the principles that you feel are sacred, and you realise that in this country they are written down, but they're written down on primary legislation, which of course can be removed, and that's why the Human Rights Act fight is such an important one. But it's also why it's one that can feel quite existential. It's not to say that some of these rights don't exist in the common law. It's not to say that there aren't other ways that you could try and shore up some of these protections. I recognise that those things are true, but the fact of the matter is that if tomorrow you took away the Human Rights Act, there are areas of protection or areas where the state is not allowed to trespass that simply would not receive the same vigilant guardianship by the courts if they didn't have recourse to that piece of legislation. And I've had the pleasure very recently of welcoming an American colleague to Liberty, who is formerly from the ACLU, and watching her grapple, great lawyer though she is, watching her grapple with a country where you can't reach for the Constitution, but you instead have to reach for the Human Rights Act and hope that that stays, and even in the Human Rights Act, grapple with these strange things that are qualified rights, and then give over to judges how they might determine those rights on a case-by-case basis. That has been fascinating. And for me, it has only re-energised my sense of commitment to why we need to fight very hard indeed for things like the Human Rights Act and the Equality Act and the architecture of a movement of civil liberties, which absolutely must remain standing. I feel also a lot of, it really echoes with me, this idea that the law is one tool. And there's that great quote from Alba Sachs, which I always think of, which is that nothing is permanent if you have the right power tools. And I always think of the law as being like a power tool, that it can be used in that way. But I think also, just like with the ACLU, at Liberty we are grappling with how you bring people with you in that fight, because you can use so-called elite strategies all you like. You can have the Human Rights Act. You can have, at times, a government that isn't trying to repeal the Human Rights Act. You can have judges who don't mind upholding the Human Rights Act in their decisions, and lawyers who love to bring cases about the Human Rights Act. In the end, if families and communities up and down the country don't feel like the Human Rights Act is relevant to them, don't feel like it does something for them, then firstly, it's not doing what it could, and so it's failing them, but also it always will remain vulnerable to political vagaries. So what that means is, while keeping your lawyers and your lobbyists, you need to also think about how you win hearts and minds. And I think have a little bit of humility about the fact that sometimes we are not the best messengers for that cause, and that we need to think a little bit more inclusively and a little bit more rigorously about how we might spread the word of why these things are important. And I don't think you need to look much further than the recent expose of misogyny and patriarchy that has been sweeping, again, particularly the States and here in the UK, but other countries too, of course. And again, leaving aside the problems with that movement, and it's not perfect, but we have perhaps seen in the last few months, we have perhaps seen the patriarchy just wobble a little bit on its pedestal. And that's not because last year we passed the Equality Act or the Human Rights Act. It's not because sexual harassment became a crime 3 months ago. We already had that architecture, but women were not, by and large, able to speak out against the power structures that architecture did not dismantle. So that, to me, says you need those structures, because now, for those women, hopefully, those laws and those rules are going to be vital in holding people to account and achieving institutional and systemic change. But they weren't enough. And so something else needs to change. Something else needs to tip the balance so that people, and particularly the people who are most affected by these pernicious imbalances of power, so that those people feel like they can stand up and advocate on their own behalf and achieve change. And I think organisations like Liberty and like the ACLU have a responsibility to stand with those people and to empower them to bring about that change. So what I hope is that we can borrow some of the shock and horror of what's happening overseas. We can learn from the real positivity that I think David encapsulated this evening, and remember that we would be lazy at best, but I think dangerously hypocritical at worst, if we don't seize the moment now with some of the things that we know are happening here, and some of the things that we could see happening here in just a few years' time if we don't act now. I think if we don't do that, then we're not active citizens, and we're not activist lawyers, and we're not human rights campaigners. And David had a lovely quote about hope, and I have one, but I can't remember who said it. Someone said, it's terrible, when you do reply, you can't really prepare. Someone said, hope is work. And I think that that's very powerful, because I think being hopeful does take work, and working to achieve change takes real diligence and real rigour and real commitment every day. And I think we all in this room owe it to everyone outside this room to fight that fight, even though perhaps sometimes things don't feel as bad on this side of the Atlantic as they do over in America. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed. David and Martha have both agreed to take questions, and I think there's some roving mics around here somewhere. Great, some hands have gone up. Can I ask you to say who you are before we ask your question? If you can, this person here.
Hi, my name is Reagan Leahy, and I work here at Hogan Levels. In terms of the memos that the ACLU team drafted that you hope to get through a more progressive liberal court, could you share an example of one?
That's attorney-client work product. No, but I mean, I think you can. It's not hard to imagine the court, particularly under Chief Justice Earl Warren in the 50s and 60s, created a whole host of doctrines that imposed civil rights obligations on the states, that expanded the rights for criminal defendants, for women, with respect to abortion, obviously on the subject of race, and all of those areas of law have, in some sense, withstood the test of time. That has not been overturned, but in another sense have been chipped away at and cut back at by 4 decades of more conservative courts. And so, I think with a liberal court, these would not be radical transformations. I don't think if you want radical transformation, you go to law school. I don't think you go to courts for radical transformation. I think you go to courts for incremental change, but incremental. We were looking at those areas where we thought incremental change could lead to a more fulsome protection of rights.
Yes, there's a question down here.
Thank you. Am I speaking correctly, everyone here?
Yes.
Good. Geoffrey Littman, barrister. To hear that there's any organisation that can attract a membership of 1 3/4 million to us British people sounds quite mind-blowing. But we do know that the population of the USA is incredibly larger than ours. Is it more than 10 times? I can't remember.
300 million.
Yeah, well, 5 times. We get sometimes the impression that the liberal conscience in the USA is to be located along the Atlantic coast and the Pacific coast. There's an awful lot in between. So what's the geographical spread of this huge membership, if you're able to tell us?
Yeah, so that's a great question. We have, the ACLU is a national organization, but we are a national organization with a foot in every state. We have affiliates in every state in the union, and then we have a national office. So we have membership in all 50 states, significant membership in all 50 states. In terms of the breakdown, I'm sure that we have a higher membership in blue states, which are the states that tend to vote Democratic, than in red states, which are the states that tend to vote Republican. That's to be sure, although there is a sizable proportion of the Republican conservative vote, which is libertarian and works with us, and because they share distrust of government power over some of the same issues. But yeah, we have the same geographic breakdown in a sense. The ACLU and the United States have the same geographic breakdown that I think you see here in the UK, that I think you see in Europe, and that is, between the urban and rural populations. And urban populations tend to be more diverse, tend to be more progressive. Rural populations tend to be less diverse, tend to be much less progressive. And one of the only reason that Donald Trump is president of the United States, well, one of the reasons that Donald Trump is president of the United States is because our electoral college system gives disproportionate voter power to rural areas over urban areas. So he was able to become president losing the popular vote. And that is but that's a problem that I think is not unique to the United States. It's a problem throughout the West, and that is the growing divide between the urban and the rural populations.
Yes, there's a question over here. Yes. Sorry, Martha.
Hi, my name's Ian and I work at Liberty. David, this is a question. Sorry, Martha, I'll leave our questions till another time. You did mention briefly then the sort of strain of the Republican Party that has very libertarian ideals. The current Attorney General of the United States, Jeff Sessions, once described the ACLU as un-American and a communist organization. I was wondering whether you could talk a little bit about your relationship with the Republican Party.
With the Communist Party.
With the Communist Party of the United States, yeah. With the Republican Party and its sort of more libertarian elements, and whether in a situation where the Republicans hold power in almost all of the branches of power, how you can sort of mine that strain of libertarian thought.
Yeah. So I mean, we have been, the ACLU has been from the outset a nonpartisan organization. We neither endorse nor oppose candidates for elective office or appointive office, and we do so in significant part because we are committed to these principles, and we will work with anyone else who is committed to these principles, regardless of party affiliation. And so there are areas where we're able to work across the aisle and attract Republican support. One area is surveillance and privacy in particular, because of concerns about a libertarian doesn't generally is not happy with the government peering into his cell phone or his laptop or his home, and so we've been able to work with Republicans across the aisle and Democrats across the aisle on that set of issues. Another area where there's actually a remarkable bipartisan work going on right now, and notwithstanding the polarization in the United States and notwithstanding the election of Donald Trump, is on criminal justice reform and reduction of mass incarceration. That is an issue on which we are in a coalition with that includes the Tea Party, the ACLU, the Koch brothers. I don't know if people know the Koch brothers, but they are the biggest supporters of conservative presidential candidates. George Soros, the biggest supporter of liberal presidential candidates, all together working on reducing the what I think is the greatest civil rights crisis in America, and that is the mass incarceration that we have inflicted upon the most disadvantaged members of our community. And so yeah, we're wherever possible, we work across the aisle.
Yes, question down here. Yeah.
I'm Corey from Liberty. Martha, I'm glad you find my nostalgia for constitutional rights amusing. David, I was wondering if you saw, in part of the hopeful picture. I mean, you said that 2/3 of state houses are controlled by Republicans, but I was wondering if you saw at the state level, despite all the chaos and terribleness at the federal level, signs that the awakening that you described of people, the galvanizing movement of recognizing the threat, if you saw positive signs of that really translating into policy change or political change at the state level in states that aren't, that have that, that aren't controlled by Republicans.
Yeah. So, a couple of things on the state. I mean, the states. I mean, one of the, I think one of the real opportunities that the United States system of government provides for anyone who is interested in social change or advocacy is that we have so many forums to advance an argument, to try to get a hearing. And you can use those forums in a very strategic way, particularly if you take the long view. So I wrote a book in 2016 called Engines of Liberty, the power of citizen activists to make constitutional law, in which I looked at how marriage equality came to pass in the United States, how the right to bear arms, our odd constitutional right, which was rejected for 100 years by our federal courts, came to be recognized in 2008 by the Supreme Court. And what I saw in both instances was it wasn't about clever lawyers making brilliant arguments before the Supreme Court and convincing the Supreme Court to change its mind. It was about work done by civil society organizations, the gay rights organizations with marriage equality, and the NRA, a tremendously effective civil liberties organization with one liberty that it focuses on the other. And what did they do? They used the states. So they knew that if they went into federal court and said there's a right to marriage under the Due Process Clause and the Equal Protection Clause, they would lose. There was no support for that. In fact, somebody did try to do that in 1972, and it was rejected by the court with a single sentence: this doesn't even present a serious federal question. Same thing with the gun rights folks. They knew that if they went into court and said the Second Amendment protects an individual right to bear arms, the court would say, no, it doesn't, because for 100 years we've been saying it doesn't. It protects only the rights of states to have militias against an overweening federal military. And so they didn't go to federal court. They went to the states. And they made arguments in states, and they chose their states carefully. And so the marriage equality folks started in Vermont, about the most progressive state in the country, the home of Bernie Sanders. Need I say more? The NRA started its campaign in Florida, which is often refers to itself as the Sunshine State. The NRA refers to it as the Gunshine State because it is so hospitable to legislation that protects gun rights. And they would pass legislation in Florida and then take it to Alabama and then take it to Mississippi, et cetera. And so by the time the case went to the Supreme Court in 2008 on gun rights, the NRA had already gotten virtually every state in the union to recognize a right to bear arms under their state law, which makes it a lot easier for the federal government, for the court to recognize as a matter of federal law. And the same thing with marriage equality. They engaged in a state strategy, an incrementalist strategy, taking a victory here, going there, and developing arguments, staying away from federal court until they were ready to go to federal court. So that's one way in which one can use the multiple forums that a federalist system provides to try to advance arguments that just wouldn't win at the national level until they get enough momentum. But the federalist system also provides opportunities for pushback in resistance in a time like today. And so some of the most effective lawsuits against President Trump have been brought by state attorneys general. State attorneys general in New Jersey or Maryland or California or Hawaii. The case that is going to the Supreme Court, being litigated by Hogan Lovells, is on behalf of the Attorney General of Hawaii challenging the Muslim ban. And the state attorneys general have the power to represent their citizenry, and so they are able to get over some of the standing hurdles that our jurisprudence otherwise poses for others, but can themselves be sites of resistance. So I've become something of a fan of federalism.
Thanks.
Michael Pollack, I'm a barrister and a member of the Human Rights Lawyers Association. Martha, this question's for you. I found what you said very refreshing when you reminded the audience to challenge those who we see as being on our own side in the human rights community about human rights, freedom of expression in regards to no platforming, that kind of thing. And my question is this. The ACLU has a very long record of defending very unpopular people on the basis of civil liberties, like far-right groups, the Ku Klux Klan, and other types of groups like this. Do you think that us in the human rights community would bring more of the general population along with us if we can sell human rights as being something which is universal and helps people in that way? And I know it's not a question in regards to liberty, it's about what we can do to bring people along into the human rights kind of supporting community.
Yes, I mean, for sure, I think that there's something in human rights for everyone, and I've yet to have a conversation, and that includes, with very sceptical relatives and also with some pretty sceptical clients when I was practicing, where you can't find a way in to show that person, even if it's by reference to their own situation, why human rights are important, and then to use that to extrapolate outwards and further to find a place together where they understand why universal human rights are of some significance. And I think that's partly because it is pretty instinctive. I think most people do understand relationships of power, and whether someone's understanding comes from their interaction with the police or a nurse or a doctor or a teacher, usually you can find a way in. And I do think it behoves everyone who cares about these issues to think about their audience when they're talking about them, and to think about, as I said earlier, whether they're the right messengers. And so, sometimes I am not going to be the right messenger on some of these things, and I fully accept that and need to be savvy about it. And yes, I think we would lose credibility enormously if we didn't extend those principles to causes that we think are unsavory. I mean, I actually think we're pretty good at that, and people have been representing terrorists and in the name of human rights. Unfortunately, that doesn't bring a lot of people with you. Maybe if you represented a far-right group, you might bring some people with you, but I'm not sure that these are the kind of big hearts and minds causes. So I think it is about balancing, sticking to your principles and taking those important cases, particularly when they can bring about some systemic change, but also championing the ones that are easier for people to find as a way in. I say that, the only thing that I then always want to kind of caveat that with is I am not in favour of shying away from the hard cases. So you do need to talk about why it matters for children and why human rights help elderly people in nursing homes, because that does make it real. But you also then need to be able to very staunchly defend why you represent prisoners and believe in their right to access behaviour offending courses or whatever. Because if you don't defend those cases, and if organisations like Liberty don't defend those cases, the national security cases, the immigration cases, the sex offender cases, no one else is going to. And then you will end up with a majoritarian approach to human rights, and that's then not human rights at all.
Thank you. I think we've got time for a few more questions. There's one here.
Hi, my name's Griff. I'm from the Civil Liberties NGO Big Brother Watch. I wanted to ask you, Martha, you spoke and you gave a personal example of, or an example of an individual conversation that you had with the couple at the Trump rally, and about them not being aware that there were places like Yarlswood and immigration detention centres. How would you, I mean, to ask you to expand on that, how would you try and sort of get the message of trying to galvanise people in the same way that the ACLU has been able to on a very, very large scale in America with this sort of, using the bogeyman of Trump? Like, how would you try and do that on a national level in this country?
So thank you for giving me the opening to remind everyone that Liberty is a membership organisation. We can only do our work if we... So I think it's different issue by issue, but to take the immigration detention example, and I think the thing that's potentially quite unique about that example at the moment in this country is that certainly the research that Liberty has done and other organisations working on it, Amnesty among others, is that it's an issue that very few people know about, and when you tell them about it, they're pretty quickly outraged. So you will find a segment of the population who typically would tick the box that they are in favour of all the other things that Liberty works on, most, maybe not surveillance, but most of the other things, and then just wouldn't even know that immigration detention is happening, wouldn't know that it's executive, wouldn't know that it's indefinite, wouldn't know how many people it affects every year. So when you're in the territory of that kind of issue, I think then it is about a kind of awareness-raising approach and reaching your base and activating your base, which is easier in some way, or should be easier than taking a much harder issue and trying to even having to convert your base. So that's where I think campaigning and communications comes in. And I think it also comes back to the point I was making about authenticity, because what I think you need to do, and I think the value of organisations like Liberty, is to say we can help with strategy and tactics, but we're not mass mobilisation organisations. Liberty has just over 11,000 members. But we can work with organisations who have much bigger membership bases, and we can work with community groups. And I think progress on that issue I feel very hopeful about, because there is a real groundswell among some portions of the public, and there is a real groundswell among politicians on both sides of the aisle. There was a great article in the New Yorker, it's another influence of the American in my midst now, about protesting and whether there's any point to it. And it is a relevant divergence, but they talked about how in the civil rights movement, it looks like it was a kind of organic process, that Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on the bus, and from there came this incredible mass movement. But of course, Rosa Parks wasn't the first person to refuse to give up her seat. She was very carefully chosen as exactly the right person to front the campaign, kicking off the moment when someone refused to give up their seat on the bus, which would then spark a whole load of other things that had been pre-planned. And it wasn't the first time that Martin Luther King gave that speech. It was the third time. He just gave it in Washington with a better sound system, and the photographers had a better angle so they could get amazing photographs of him giving it. So I think the role of Liberty with issues like immigration detention and others is to say we can think strategically and tactically about how to harness this very powerful and important issue, but we can only do that with the credibility and authenticity of the people who can speak about it from their own experience. And it is, if you can bring together those two things, then I think you have something approaching a strategic mass mobilisation campaign that will then result in a change to the law, ultimately.
We're running a little bit over, but I think we'll try and fit in a couple more questions if there are any. So, yeah, there's one up at the top up here. Just,
ultimately, the best response to Trump is to vote him out at the ballot box. Do you think that the kind of responses that you have been seeing in the United States are likely to translate to increased voter turnout at, for example, the midterm elections coming up or 2 years after that? And what is being done to increase the number of voters and voter registration in the United States so that people can vote him out?
So great question, and absolutely there will be a much greater turnout. I often say that the Trump victory, there's some tendency to overread the Trump victory. People see it as this upsurge in white working class resentment leading to the election of Donald Trump as the president of the United States. The reality is, and there's some truth to that, But the reality is that Trump got the same number of votes as John McCain and Mitt Romney, the Republican candidates for president who ran against Obama in the prior two elections. The same number of votes. You didn't get any more votes, you got the same number of votes. That's how many votes the Republican presidential candidate gets. Hillary Clinton got 5 million fewer votes than Barack Obama in 2008 or 2012. So it's not so much, and she still won the popular election, but it's not so much that Donald Trump won the election, the Republicans won the election, as that the Democrats lost the election by failing to turn out. Why did they not turn out? Well, I think one reason they didn't turn out is because, like me, no, I did turn out, but like me, everybody knew what the result was going to be. And so, why bother voting if it's obvious that Hillary Clinton's going to win? And it was obvious that Hillary Clinton was going to win until that day. And I'm speaking as myself. The ACLU is nonpartisan, but I voted for Hillary. And that day, I went home proud that I was going to see the first woman get elected. It didn't happen that way, but I think many people thought, well, it's a done deal. Two, many people were turned off by Hillary because of the very effective job that Bernie Sanders did in exposing her problems, Goldman Sachs and the like. And so they didn't want to, they were sort of like disdainful. I don't want to, dirty my hands by voting for this corporate tool, so I'm not going to vote. And then a fair amount of sexism in the mix as well. But at the end of the day, it was the failure of turnout on the liberal side that led to the result, not some huge Republican turnout. They got the same turnout they always get. So, and I don't think that mistake will be made again. I don't think Donald Trump could have gotten elected on November 9th. He got elected on November 8th, but if people knew that there was a chance that he'd get elected, there would have been a much bigger turnout on the Democratic side, and he wouldn't have been elected. In fact, I'm not sure he could have got elected any day after November 8th, because he came to office with the lowest approval rating of any American president in history, and his approval rating has dropped ever since. There have been two statewide elections since the Trump election, one in Virginia and one in Alabama to fill particular seats. And in both, there was very, very strong turnout on the Democratic side, and Democratic candidates won, even in Alabama, which is a seriously, seriously red state. So, I don't think people are going to forget, in November, what they felt the day after President Trump was elected, what they felt at the Women's March, what they felt at the airport demonstrations and the like. And we're certainly, hopeful that people will come out and vote for candidates that defend civil liberties and believe in the rule of law and the like, and that this will be a shorter problem than it might otherwise have been. Democracy, the bottom line, democracy is, that quote from Learned Hand, it's really, democracy needs to be a defender of civil liberties. The NRA, which I studied for my book, they understand that at the end of the day, it's the power of the democratic process that advances and defends liberty. And they have 5 million members. Like we're proud that we have 1.75 million. We have to cover all the rights in the Bill of Rights. They only have to cover one right, and they've got 5 million members. And those people act when the NRA asks them to act. And that's where the NRA's power comes from. That's why they're as effective as they are. That's why they are actually a more effective guardian of the right to bear arms than the courts are, even after the courts have recognized a right, because they're able to defeat measures that the court would uphold as consistent with the Second Amendment, and they're able to get measures enacted that the court would not require under the Second Amendment. It's through the democratic process.
I think I'm going to hand over to Rachel now to close this event.
Thank you very much. My name is Rachel Logan. I'm the legal director at Amnesty International in the UK, and I also sit on the executive committee of the HRLA. And in that capacity, it falls to me to say an enormous thank you, first of all, to Hogan Lovells for making tonight possible, and particularly to Charles Brastad for his warm welcome, and Dervla Sim and Jan Howard on the Hogan's team for all of their support in organising tonight. And thanks, of course, to Alba and to Martin Westgate QC for chairing tonight, and also to Eric Fripp for all the hard work in making tonight happen. And finally, thank you to David and Martha for not only your inspiring contribution tonight, but also for the contribution that you've both made so far to ensuring not only that we hold the line on human rights and civil liberties, but that we continue to push it forward. And David, you wrote in your latest excellent book, in the introduction, that if we fight, we can prevail. And I think that's also the message that we will take away from tonight. So thank you very much. And please, everybody, join us for drinks. If you can, stay along. And can I urge anyone who is not yet a member of HRLA or Alba to consider joining us? And please all just join me in a final show of appreciation for all of our speakers and everyone tonight.